So we'll work it out, though. I'm just if you can stay on, just so we kind of watch what's going on. I'm going to get into a mute as well for the meeting. And you guys are live right now.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our policy meeting tonight, Thursday, April 16th, 2020, and the time is approximately 5:35 p.m. The first item on our agenda is the approval of minutes from our February 4th, 2020 meeting. Have policy members been able to take a look at that? And if you have any questions or comments before we move that forward? I've looked through the minutes and they look good. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes?
Yes, I motion.
Yes. Okay. Second, all in favor? So moved. So the minutes of February 4th, 2020 have been approved. The next item on our agenda is pretty much going to cover this policy committee meeting. It's distance learning discussion. And we will be looking into that and really working on forming. We don't have a distance learning policy. Neighboring districts are starting to work on that. New Canaan has one. They have a very basic brief policy, but they do have one. We're also looking at Canton and Portland. CABE has put some suggestions together. So I think as a policy committee, in order for us to continue to move forward with distance learning, we definitely need to have some type of policy in place. We'll also be looking at GPAs as well, and pass or fail. I know that there's been some concern about that. I believe our students are now starting, I think today was the first day of the fourth quarter. So I know that there's been some concern and some angst about that. So I think the more we look at this, the more we're able to establish a new policy. Dr. Costanzo has done a great job in reaching out to other districts, as I mentioned before, and he has a slide presentation that he's going to present right now as far as getting some ideas and possibly thinking of how we want to move a policy forward. So Dr. Costanzo, I'm going to have you start speaking about this as well.
Very good. Thank you, Heidi. And
you're welcome.
To our policy committee members. So I have shared my screen for you. We have a brief PowerPoint that I will take you through. About a week or so ago, the superintendent reached out to Heidi and myself and explained that there were some districts in Fairfield County that were beginning to discuss a distance learning policy who did not have one in their manual. New Canaan was the most recent district to actually complete a policy. It was included in the email that was sent out to you from Maura. Very, very basic, basically just setting what the standard is for graduating or for high school students and earning credit from home. So what I'd like to be able to accomplish tonight are three things really. One is to review goals and objectives for adopting a distance learning policy here in Norwalk. Second, to talk a little bit about a distance learning policy timeline for us, given that we are into mid-April, and guidance from the Centers for Disease Control are estimating that the potential exists for another wave of COVID-19 to occur in the fall and potentially up to 18 months out. So we would be in better position as a district having a distance learning policy in place with clear expectations for staff and students. And then lastly, we'll take an initial look at the policies that were sent in the email, including the Shipment and Goodwin model policy, the CABE model policy, and some of the local district policies that followed the CABE model policy that was in one bundle that was sent to you. Another goal at the end of this meeting, given the questions that are surfacing relative to grading in the district during this particular COVID crisis in our current school shutdown, Dr. Myers is going to join us on the call. to talk about some work she has done with principals in the district to define a fair grading policy or grading procedure, I should say, between now and the end of the school year. The tenet of it really is grade bracing and utilizing the mid-year grade. And she can get into the details for each level of it within the system a bit later tonight. So transitioning here to goals and objectives, as I thought about this, I think there are really three core areas that we need to be thinking about in the goals that we want for our own Norwalk Public School distance learning policy. The first is really to design a high-level overall plan that serves students well during times when distance learning presents the best or the only opportunity for students to learn and grow. And where applicable, and this is particularly the case at the high school level, earn credits towards high school graduation. Second, a policy that will guide and inform present and future distance learning, interpreting it and making decisions for district administrators, teachers, students, families. And I think a good policy really starts with the board's belief about distance learning. And we saw that in a couple of the models that we shared with you on Friday of last week. And I think that it'll be important for us as a committee to come up with a draft policy that really sets out the belief that the values that we have about distance learning right up front. And then third, and perhaps most importantly, a policy that acknowledges and seeks to address the socioeconomic inequities of our student population relative to technology and connectivity resources, as well as their families' ability to access distance learning. I've been doing some research on this over the past few days, and it's quite clear that students who are low income or historically disenfranchised from the public schools to begin with experience more difficulty during these times than students who don't meet that profile. And there's been a lot written just in the past couple of weeks speaking to the fact that it's quite likely that we will see student achievement gaps widen and expand during this school closure period. And that's happening for a number of reasons. The students lack the technology resources in their homes, or they lack internet connection, or their families are unable to support them during the learning day. And that is primarily because they're either working during the time that students are expected to log on and participate in activities, or the parents do not speak English as a primary language and struggle to understand and comprehend what it is that the teacher is asking the students to do. So I think it's going to be important that be an element of this eventual policy. What I did notice in my review of the policies that were emailed late last week is that the policies really reflect a pre-COVID-19 world. There's no discussion about prolonged school shutdowns because of health emergencies or other sorts of emergencies. The distance learning policies ranged in design and passage from the early 2000s. I think I saw one that went back to 2004 through about the middle of the past decade, 2015, 2016. And so they made a good first effort at thinking about mastery learning in the sense that a student could take an online course for credit, but it really did not address some of the issues that are being presented in this current pandemic. And I think that that is going to be important for us to think about and consider when we move our draft policy to the full board. I think it needs to reflect what we're currently going through now and and what we may potentially be going through again in the fall or winter of the next school year. If we move ahead here, you can see the policy design timeline. It doesn't give us a whole lot of time, starting with tonight. We're looking to review and discuss our goals and objectives, which we have done, to begin to design the policy after we've had an opportunity to look at the policies that have been presented as models. Also tonight, it'll be important that Dr. Meyer share the work that she's been doing on grading during this pandemic. Later in April, we'll fine tune a date. I know that Heidi is in the process of working on solidifying a date. We want to hold an additional policy meeting in late April or early May to give us some additional time to plan together the draft policy. There's going to be quite a bit of work that will need to go into this policy in between our meetings. And I think we need another check-in before this policy were to get approved at the policy committee level and moved on to the full board meeting. Ideally, we would have the full board have an opportunity to review a first read of the distance learning policy at the May meeting, with the board approving a final distance learning policy at the June meeting. This would allow us to get the policy added to our policy manual. We would then be able to look at it and work with our staff and develop procedures for the 2020-2021 school year. So that's the timeline. We're going to now shift into reviewing the Shipment and Goodwin model and the CABE model and the local district policy that are associated with that. So if it's helpful to you, I can pull this up. Are you able to see the Shipment and Goodwin policy on my desktop right now?
Yes, I can see it.
You are?
Yep.
Okay. So I'll keep this current view on for us for this purpose. So this is what John Mooney was able to share. You can see that it's a Series 6000 instruction related policy. It was worked on in 2014, and the policy is fairly standard. While we don't have a distance learning policy, this is fairly consistent with what you would see in other distance learning policies. It states Connecticut, or references Connecticut General Statute 10-221, which is really focused on online course credit acquisition for high school students who are taking courses on the internet as opposed to sitting in at a desk in a classroom at their traditional high school. And then there's a list, a pre-approval section here that reviews online courses to be used towards high school graduation requirements. Students must, prior to registering for the course, receive approval from the high school principal or his or her designee. I'm quite confident that this would be the procedure that either any of the 4 high schools would take, probably starting with their school counselor. But that's the process that Shipment outlines. And that's really the extent of this policy. And I think this is a good first start. It needs to be incorporated in our policy. We really need to look beyond this and be pioneers in getting a policy developed and in place that reflects what is possible in the fall and in the winter of next year. I'm going to forward or shift now to the CABE policy bundle. I've made some highlighted notes, kind of chicken scratch, that I can to you as we go through this. I meet weekly with the chiefs in the cabinet. We've been doing that during a 2-hour Zoom conference once per week, in addition to the superintendent's weekly meetings. And I brought up the distance learning piece with them recently. They were fairly adamant that what we're seeing from researchers and universities is that they're referring distance learning more as continuous educational opportunities, almost in place of distance learning. And we also talked about the need to be broad in terms of the various ways that students might be learning from their remote location. And that includes electronic media communication and instruction. It can happen through audio. It can happen through video. And then you'll see some of the verbiage here with synchronous and asynchronous. And Dr. Myers has spoken a little bit about this earlier in the COVID crisis, just in terms of having the flexibility for some grade levels of students to be working at the same time, in the same content area, more or less at the same pace, which would be synchronous, versus an asynchronous approach where you define the time of the day, and it might be a 4 or 5 hour window, and students and their parents are given several different areas of instruction that they are to be working in and completing assignments in, but it doesn't necessarily have to be completely aligned or in sync with what's happening in real time. So I think we want to be able to provide a continuous educational opportunity for Norwalk students that allows for both of those learning environments to take place remotely. Further down in that first paragraph, and again, you can see what's not highlighted is standard, it's CABE language, but it does not get into our current reality. And so down at the bottom, I've added some language here that the district may impose set windows of time during the day for which students should be logged on to the learning platform for the purposes of attendance taking, engagement, and or participation. And we have that at some elements in the system where it's expected that students are logging onto their computer at 8 or 8:30, attendance is being taken, and then there's a 4 hour time period where learning activities are occurring at the same time. In the next paragraph, you'll see some discussion about virtual and online courses, district's educational program delivery system to increase accessibility and flexibility in the delivery of instruction. I think that language is important to maintain. And then in addition to regular classroom-based instruction, I've added, or in lieu of regular classroom-based instruction during a health or other emergency requiring a prolonged school district closure, students in the district may earn credit through distance education provided by virtual or online courses. The next paragraph speaks more specifically about high school and the ability to earn credit when not in a traditional classroom with a teacher in the classroom. Again, it references the statute that we talked about earlier, and it gets into some specific instructional pieces that any district would want to have in place, like the workload required is similar to what would be happening within reason in the classroom. Content is rigorous and aligned with the curriculum standards and guidelines that are approved by the state board. The course engages students and has interactive components, which may include but are not limited to required interactions between students and their teachers, participation in online demonstrations, discussion boards, or virtual labs. It requires that the program is taught by teachers who are Connecticut certified and have received training on teaching in an online learning environment. That's an area where Norwalk, as well as many other districts, have a lot of work to do. I read a piece from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And Paul Revel is interviewed and talks about the fact that he had come across a district in New Hampshire, in northern New Hampshire, that is out so frequently because of snow cancellations that they've established a full-fledged backup plan anytime school closes. Teachers are prepared to teach, to have live streaming and video, and it's seamless. Snow days are not counted against the district because the district has invested heavily in preparing teachers with the requisite knowledge and skills they need to conduct class as they would if they were in the classroom. So it'll be important that we start to concentrate our professional development in the future on bringing our teachers up to speed. Some of our teachers are really doing an outstanding job. In fact, most are, but we do have some who are just not used to it. And it's going to take some time, and professional development will go a long way. This also talks about institutions of higher education providing some of the work, and that needs to be, those courses need to be accredited courses by the Department of Higher Ed. You'll see here at the bottom, the high school graduation requirement can happen upon the successful completion of the board examination series, permitting students in grades 9 through 12 to substitute achievement of a passing score on a series of examinations for meeting credit requirements for graduation. So you might know that the SAT in June has been canceled, and that has happened for good reason. And this is, an example in this policy of how we would need to look for assessments other than traditional standardized measures. There's a piece here I'm not very familiar with. We can look into this further, but it specifically cites the dropout rate for a district. And if it's determined to be 8% or higher than the previous school year, the Board of Ed shall establish an online credit recovery program for those students who are identified as being in danger of failing. Now, I don't believe our dropout rate is anywhere near 8%, but we have an established online credit recovery program that we implement on an annual basis. Last year, we did it at one of the 2 high schools, and we plan to replicate that again this summer. Of course, there's more unknowns to this summer school because we don't know whether or not we'll be able to access buildings during the summer. And if we are, it could very well be a much more robust summer school, given the amount of time that students have been out. And there may be parents really looking for students to have some traditional classroom instruction happen this summer. A little further along in the policy here, this may or may not be something we wish to incorporate into the policy, but it just provides some context for the time in which we developed our design for the policy. And so I've included here that this policy was designed during the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020, a time when school districts across the state and region remained closed for months, prompting local boards of education to temporarily replace traditional classroom learning with student-centered, interactive, and engaging online learning. And then I started to build, one of the objectives at the beginning of this presentation was, let's make sure that we're not forgetting about our disenfranchised students and those that really lack the resources at home. And so you can see that apparent in this paragraph. Not surprisingly, it's believed that prolonged school closures disproportionately impact low-income students whom lack the resources and access to equitable online learning experiences. And then I went a step further and said, understanding, addressing, and mitigating this inequity is a cornerstone of this policy. In other words, the district will continue to focus on reducing the student achievement gap, particularly given the realities of gap widening during prolonged school closure periods for low-income students. A little further down, I just added some language that incorporates our new reality. So you can see in that next modified paragraph, the district will not use online courses as the sole medium for instruction in any required subject area for students in grades K-8. Now, that may have sufficed pre-COVID-19, but there's no district in the state of Connecticut that can claim that right now. So I think we need policy language that provides us with the flexibility to only offer online learning methods for sustaining a safe student learning environment. And I've just really copied that statement in the next paragraph. And you can see that here. That just really captures the K-12. This next paragraph gets into more specifics about high school students and credit acquisition. We're going to need to work with Dr. Myers and the curriculum office on coming up with that particular unit total because we are making some adjustments, or the proposal has been discussed to make some adjustments to the required number of at least credits that would be acquired in the freshman year of high school. Students would still be required to complete the same number of 26 credits, but we may want to add some more detail about individual grade levels. And then you can see here further down, credit from an online or virtual course or university college course may be earned only in the following circumstances. And they're listed here. I've added, and I think we'll need to tweak that language a bit to include, a situation like we're currently in. But down here at the bottom, you can see here I've highlighted the district has shut down schools because of a health or other emergency and has, for an undetermined time, replaced traditional classroom learning with a distance learning program. So that's the extent of my adjustments to the model policy. There's more here. If you see, district review committee is a recommendation that CABE makes. Superintendent shall establish a committee to review all distance education courses prior to use by the district. I think that it makes good sense to involve the new superintendent in that discussion as soon as possible, so that by the time this policy is passed, this district review committee reflects her prerogatives in terms of who those folks should be at the table. A little further down, you'll see evaluation, and we'll need to be careful about this. In the Federation's MOU with the Board of Education, there is language that basically underscores that principals will be mindful of the extenuating circumstances of this crisis. The MOU was finalized prior to the State Board of Education nullifying 2019-2020 evaluations for all certified staff in Connecticut. But nevertheless, as we think about the potential for an 18-month cyclical coronavirus peak and low, it's possible that we could be out, and we might be forced to look at that MOU, which states that principals do need to model or do need to monitor the effectiveness of distance teaching and learning. So we'll need to look at this more closely before we finalize this, and it'll need to be aligned with what we have already agreed to with the Federation. That might be a good point to stop because the Portland, Connecticut policy follows this, and we may want to spend a bit more time looking at the individual local board policies that follow this. But why don't we pause here and get some input, some feedback, some questions going based upon what we've talked about so far.
I'll start it off. I think, I had some time to look through these, and I think Frank, I really like the way you highlighted some certain areas and added some verbiage in as well. I think there's a lot to digest here because there are a lot of different policies. I think New Canaan is very basic, and I think that's a good one to look at, but we obviously need to add more and have more input. But I personally think the combination of all of these, if we can combine them into one and kind of customize it for Norwalk, I think would work very well. And as you had mentioned, it's evolving. We're not sure what's going to happen 2 weeks from now versus 2 months from now. We just don't know. And I think looking at some of these other policies, you're right. I think some of them were adopted in 2004 and some were revised in 2010, but it's a very different environment now than it was back in 2004 and 2010. So I think there has to be a lot of tweaking, which I think you did looking at this, but I think if we can combine a lot of that and the knowledge that we have now, I think would make for a very solid policy. So I think the information we have, I think we can really craft and work with that.
Okay.
Now, does anybody else, do we have any of the other policy members want to add in any other information or thoughts?
So, hey, Frank, this looks great. This is Godfrey.
Hey, Godfrey.
I think, the attention given, being mindful that we are going through this and there's a need to review how we're doing going through this situation, I think is appropriate, for the sake of, I see this in two things. We're creating a policy in crisis, and then there's also a need to create a virtual distance learning policy, period. And being mindful that teaching doesn't look like it does now, and wouldn't look like it any normal situation when considering how our distance learning will actually be fleshed out and planned for. And I think there's a lot to take advantage of and just preparing for phases consistent with how we've done that are reflective of where we are now.
Yeah, I would
Yep.
just echo that and say that it presents us with an opportunity to not only design and pass the distance learning policy, which the district currently lacks, but to design one that reflects our new reality.
Mhm.
We can accomplish that and do both, really, in one exercise.
If I can also just jump in, I know for time's sake, due to our following board meeting after this, we're a little tight on time. So I want to make sure I know we have Dr. Myers because we're going to need to stop the meeting at 6:30 tonight so we can prepare for our upcoming Board of Ed meeting. So maybe Frank, you want to have Dr. Myers speak at this point if she's
That would
ready?
be great.
Okay,
Heidi,
Brenda,
sure.
can I just
yeah.
ask a couple questions? Or Frank,
Yes.
if you could just take these as takeaways, for consideration. So the policy on attendance during an emergency, when you kicked off, you talked about certain families needing flexibility because those children were home either watching siblings while their parents were at work during an emergency, or their parents were online working themselves and they had to conduct their homeschooling in the evening. Can there be some thought around those types of situations? Because not every family can log in at 8 o'clock in the morning till 12 o'clock in the afternoon during an emergency. So that was the first comment. I also did not see in any of the policies that were drafted any language specific to the distribution of laptops and Wi-Fi. And I thought that that was particularly important in the case where a child is expelled and we're asking them to learn virtually on our dime, that we should outline that we are going to provide the laptop and the Wi-Fi if we decide to do that as a district. And the same holds true for children with special needs. I don't know if you've had any conversations with Yvette that if we're going offline, should a policy include or not include accommodations like carts and FMs and transcripts and note taking right in the policy, so it's not left up to the PPT team to put that into the IEP. And if there could just be some due diligence on cross-referencing this with the homebound policy, if one exists, and I apologize, I don't know if one already exists prior to me being a board member, but there's reference to homebound children in this, so I'm not sure if those need to be combined at this point. And those were my 4 follow-up items.
Thank you. I can speak very quickly on these. We do have an expulsion policy. I don't know if that expulsion policy is updated with the current status of the expulsion program. You might know that we run a full day, full year program, and it takes place at the Carver Center. And students are working with a classroom teacher and working on a Chromebook. And we can take a look at that policy to see whether or not that language is incorporated. You mentioned cross-referencing any existing homebound policy. I'm quite certain we have a homebound policy, and I will take a look at that. What I noticed in some of the local board examples relative to the special education piece that you mentioned, they're pretty general about what's provided, and you'll see this if you look in here, and you probably have. There are some statements about following PPTs and individual plans, and I think the districts are intentional about leaving it broad because of how different individual plans might be. And while you want to be transparent, you also don't want to overpromise what a board is capable of doing during a required distance learning phenomenon like we're in now. So we probably could do a little bit more than what we're seeing in these policies. And I can talk to Yvette about this. I think we have to be careful not to be too prescriptive or too detailed, because that could also disadvantage the board.
Yeah, I want to have a discussion, not specifically about what accommodations are needed, but who financially is responsible for that. So an IEP may say that a child needs an FM device or cart accommodations, but that the district will provide those, and that the district will provide Wi-Fi and laptops for children, that don't have that access, just like those specifics around the provisions and modifications. Right.
No, I think that's a very good question. And districts around the state and country are grappling with that right now. How to meet those promises like we would if we were in school. You mentioned that last point about,
I'm sorry, Frank. I think also it might be a good idea once we've kind of crafted and we have an actual draft with a combination of many of these policies and insight and suggestions from policy members to also have maybe speak to Yvette as well. She could probably add some future, some thoughts and some ideas as well as we continue to craft this policy.
Agreed. And then on the point about flexibility around when to log in, that's a very strong point that you're making. We and Brenda Myers is on this call, and she can speak to the decision to, in some cases, have some structure around the 8 to 12. But there is compelling reasons to have kids together, actually viewing and seeing their teacher and their classmates at the same time. And I think that certainly has something to do with trying to move in a somewhat semi-structured day. But the reality is there are families and homes where it might not be possible to pull that off. So we'll need to give more attention to that as we fine tune this policy. And I think Brenda Myers is on this call. Dr. Myers, are you there?
Hi, Frank. Thanks, everybody. What wonderful work on such a critical policy right now. So one piece of this conversation that we've been having is about grading. And just some of the steps that we took so that you know, we did extend the third marking period by 2 weeks. So we kind of went into COVID in our first 10 days. We really were not focusing on assessments and evaluation. We were trying to get situated into this new normal. And then we began more new work. We really have a guideline of being able to give students feedback, opportunities for revision, making sure that because of this exacerbated equity issue, we're very conscious of that when we start to think about grading and being able to give kids some sort of evaluation and feedback. We have a little draft for you of our current thinking, and we have kind of a short timeline because we're looking at the end of the school year. So one of the things we want to be clear about is we have an expectation right now that when we close the school year, we will make a decision for every child about promotion to the next grade. We will be able to recommend our students for their courses for next year. We'll be able to issue transcripts to colleges, which will be very important to our juniors. And of course, we will verify that students have met all graduation requirements so that they can celebrate their graduation fully. So these have become kind of the focus or the purpose of grading that we want to make sure that we address. So we looked at right now, what are some of the recommendations? And as Frank has brought up, really trying to benchmark off of these quality conversations and what the research is suggesting, and understanding that we do have equity and access issues, and we have to balance them with something else, and that's motivation and engagement. So you want to be a little cautious that if you say to students right now, oh, it's pass fail, we'll watch some engagement start to shift, right? Because maybe my work doesn't matter as much. And if we are too harsh with high levels of accountability and one time and you have to do it, then children who are struggling with access or family or social emotional issues will be disadvantaged as well. So we want a policy that meets all of the spectrum of our students and able to address all of these issues. What we've done, and I think the best way to describe it is at the high school, because it is most high stakes at the high school, both because of the way we use grade point averages and how those are used not only in college applications, but also for scholarships and also for assigning students into courses. So meeting the graduation requirements to make sure that we have a clear transcript for our students. So what we want to do is separate the two issues. Sometimes what districts are looking at is one solution to do both things, awarding credit and GPA. And what we're doing is actually separating the two issues. Grade point average and how we determine that grade, right, which is pretty fine sort of measure. What we'd like to do is use the process called grade bracing. And this is used not only in schools, but universities as well. We know the first 20 weeks of this school year, we were face-to-face with our children, expectations were clear, and the grading and feedback was very consistent. Those grades have been set and the midterms were taken, so we have an average for the first half of the year. Now we moved into what we would call the COVID 10 weeks, right? A little bit in the classroom, a little bit of COVID, and then the last 8 weeks of school, which is right now determined to be mostly COVID. If we get back in at the very end, that's possible, but we have to think about this, that we are evaluating children on a complete distance learning program. So what we'd like to do is brace our kids at what we call the midpoint, 20 weeks plus their midterm, that average. Let's say my average was an 84. During the next 10 weeks and 10 weeks, 30 and 40, I can raise my grade. I can continue to get better. That's where the grade was braced. Or I cannot go any lower. That will be my grade. So if you have a student who is getting the 84 and is really struggling in this environment and doesn't have any support, then they would maintain their 84. if I'm a student with a 59 at midpoint, I can still raise that grade and get a passing grade for the course. So I have the ability, if I'm a 92 and I'm thinking about National Honor Society and I'm thinking about my GPA, I can still raise that 92. I can also, these would also follow all of the grade point weighting. So if it's an AP course, those grades would be weighted in the same way. So we take the midpoint, we look at how you do post the midpoint, we compare those. You are basically safe, harmless, it won't go lower, but we would continue to work with students to show growth and to get stronger. That would be used to calculate the GPA. Stop there to see if that's clear.
Very clear.
Okay, so the second question is, once you've established the grade for the course, what we'd like to do on the Norwalk Public Schools transcript is we would like to issue it as a pass-fail. So we know that in our language in Norwalk, 60, actually 59.5 because it rounds up, is a passing grade. Below that is a failing grade. So on the transcript, it would say, I took algebra this year and I got a passing grade in algebra and I have been awarded 1 credit. This way, children are not penalized, the credits move forward. And on every transcript, we would state, due to COVID, Norwalk Public Schools used pass-fail for grading this year, and that's how the credits were awarded. So there's a GPA calculation that continues with the student, but on the transcript, there would be pass-fail that would be a district decision. See if that makes any sense. Any questions on pass-fail? So in pass-fail, there's 2 other variables that we're really thinking about. We have some students in crisis, as particularly students who need additional support, and they may need an incomplete with some tutoring in June. And what we'd like to do, instead of that child failing the course, if we could determine some additional support and tutoring in June, and of course, under COVID, it would be allowed, what kind of support could we give a child? We'd like to issue a 3-week extension where they could get a support and they could move that from an incomplete to a passing. We can't give it too long because if the child is not successful, we don't want them to miss a summer school opportunity to take credit recovery, right? So we're trying to build in that extra piece for an incomplete. I don't know how wide range this would be, but I can tell you as I talk to high school students, we have students who have lost their tutoring opportunities and some of that extra support in this environment that we think we might be able to, with the teacher's help, determine who needs that little bit of extra help for the incomplete. And I just feel like it would give us a little flexibility for certain cases. Now, the question is do we want to do pass with distinction for that student who got an A in their course? Because what people feel a little bit is that pass-fail is a very wide range. That passing has a lot of flexibility. And, would it be better to distinguish the pass with distinction as the A level? It's been an interesting conversation because sometimes in our hearts, we'd like to give pass with distinction to the student who overcame a lot, but maybe barely made a 65, right? But so distinction, is it a grading of distinction, right? Is that what we would put in our definition? And remember, everything we define has to be parallel for every high school in the district and must be part of our documentation to the National Athletic Association. So we're really bound by making these decisions and being clear about them. Questions or thoughts?
Yes, if I can just add on, yes, for some of the students that are struggling, I know that you mentioned the teacher, it's so important, that teacher interaction, which I know that we have outstanding teachers that are working so well with all of our students. And it's a whole new realm for all of us, in this climate that we're dealing with, and they've gone above and beyond. But how do we really find those students that really are, like you mentioned, are struggling? Maybe they had tutors. Right now, they're not having tutors, So I'm wondering how we're able to really hone in and figure out those students that really need that extra support. I think the incomplete and giving that 3-week support is really really critical and very, very crucial to this. And that kind of helps, I'm sure, some of our students, but I'm just curious to know, Dr. Myers, from your experience, how we can kind of open that up where we can really find those students that really need that help.
And you know, our team has been doing a wonderful job with
Yeah.
supporting our students with social emotional, connecting to our social workers and our counselors. Also, I have to tell you, our L staff and our special ed staff, you know, they work family by family, student by student. And so trying to, between the teacher, the related supports, special ed and L, keeping in contact. You remember when we started this on the very first day of this journey, we made one promise that we would touch every kid every day. Learning would be second, and that's what happens in a crisis. And so I think our team has done a very good job, and I think that's why high school teachers are recognizing that this incomplete could be a helpful place for some students.
And I think as far as the pass with distinction, I think we need to have further dialogue on that. I think we want to make it fair and equitable, whether it's just a grading or if it's a student that's struggling and then really working hard to get from that, let's say, 59.5 to a 68 or a 70 or a 75. So I think we want to honor all of those students. So I think more discussion needs to happen. And I also would like to, you know, if possible, I'm working with the policy committee. We're trying to have, as Frank discussed, having another meeting, hopefully before May 5th is what we're looking at. And I'd like to see if we can also have you come back. We have about 5 more minutes, and I'd like for you to be able to also continue the conversation as well.
I appreciate that.
Okay. Are there any other policy members that want to add any questions or thoughts for Dr. Myers?
I cannot remember when in my career incomplete was an option. It was either in high school or in college, or I went to college abroad. But I do remember an incomplete being an option. Was there a reason why that was phased out in high schools and colleges 20 years ago that we should take into consideration, that we're now bringing it back?
You know, the only thing is that whenever you get a circumstance as we're living in right now, we reassess. You know, it's like, no, we really did not want to enter the end of this year with the same grading policy that we started. It wasn't that the policy was wrong, it's that it's a different time and we're in a different place. And so now we just open it back up and we say what's most important right now and what should we do so that the message is clear, so that students are still engaged and motivated, but that students are also getting the support that they need.
So there was no cons that you can recall in your professional career why that was phased out that we should take as a learning opportunity when integrating it into a new policy? Do you recall that? I remember eyes. I don't know why I remember eyes.
I remember eyes as well.
You do? Okay. Thank you.
I do. And I remember in college,
And incompletes are not uncommon in high schools.
Okay.
But typically there's an extenuating circumstance that would generate an incomplete. And there's always a timeline, right, of when to get that incomplete in.
Okay. Thank you.
And Eric, if it's worth noting, you know, the current incompletes are following situations that are, and some variation of it, a crisis, medically, or something that was that resulted in, you know, any emotional deregulation. But they currently are in place following a crisis.
Thank you.
I don't remember eyes, but I remember letters. These.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I know that we're pressed for time as far as moving on to our other Board of Ed meeting and getting that set up. But as I mentioned earlier, I am working with everyone to try to pick another date. So we're going to be seeing each other hopefully at some point next week so we can continue these conversations. And I know there's a lot that needs to be done. And I appreciate the policy committee, Frank and Brenda, really helping to craft this particular policy. I know there's a lot of work on this.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you very
you,
much.
everybody. Thank
All
you.
right.
Thank you.
Do I have a motion to adjourn the meeting?
Motion to adjourn.
Yes. Thank you so much. Meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.